My name's Jenna Reed, and a month ago, my father's will tore my family apart. I'd spent months taking care of him in his final days, feeding him, helping him breathe, listening when the pain kept him awake. My brother didn't visit once. But that morning, at the lawyer's office, he smiled like he'd already won. When the papers were read, his grin widened. To my son, he got Dad's business, the company that had made our family name mean something in Salem. And me? To my daughter Jenna, I got the old farmhouse out by the county line, the one everyone said should have been torn down years ago. He laughed under his breath. Guess loyalty doesn't pay. I didn't say a word, because if I had, I might have screamed. Miss Franklin, the lawyer, cleared her throat. Before we close, there's one more instruction concerning Jenna. She looked straight at me, her eyes unreadable. My brother frowned. Dad had been quiet the last week of his life, too quiet, almost like he'd already said what he needed to. But I'd seen the way he looked at me when I changed his blanket, how he'd whispered, "You'll understand later." That moment came sooner than I expected. Miss Franklin stacked the papers, then said in that calm, careful tone lawyers use when they're about to drop something heavy, "Actually, there's a private note for Jenna, and it changes quite a lot." My brother's smile froze. Mine didn't move at all. If you've ever wondered what real loyalty is worth, stay till the end, because what Miss Franklin told me next turned everything upside down. The rain started before I even reached the city limits of Salem. By the time I turned down the narrow county road that led to Dad's old farmhouse, my wipers were just keeping up. The headlights bounced off the wet gravel, and the mailbox leaned the same way it always had, tired, stubborn, still standing. I parked under the sagging carport, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. When I stepped inside, it felt like the house exhaled. Everything looked frozen in time, the old recliner by the window, the photographs on the mantel, the blanket folded neatly over the couch. I hung my coat, turned on one lamp, and the place came alive in amber light. My reflection stared back at me from the dusty window, pale and tense. The quiet was heavy enough to notice. I wasn't ready to sleep. My mind replayed every word from the will, the sound of Colin's smug voice echoing. I tried to push it away, but it sat in my chest like a stone. The wind pressed against the siding. Somewhere upstairs, a loose shutter clapped once. I grabbed the flashlight from the drawer and went up. Dad's room hadn't changed. His reading glasses still lay beside the bed, next to the old radio he never threw out. I sat on the edge of the mattress, tracing the grooves on the wood headboard. That's when I noticed a hollow thump when my palm brushed the wall behind the nightstand. I tapped again. The sound was different there, deeper, like the wall had something to hide. I moved the nightstand away. The wallpaper behind it was slightly discolored, a vertical line splitting the pattern. I ran my fingers along the edge until they caught on something, an uneven seam. My breath quickened, but the screws were old, half buried in paint. I didn't have the tools to pry them out. The thought of forcing it felt wrong, disrespectful even, like I'd be tearing open a wound that hadn't healed. I decided to wait until morning. Downstairs I made tea, but it went cold before I drank it. I sat at the kitchen table and watched the light from the porch flicker through the rain. The roof creaked under the storm. For a moment I thought I heard a cough, but it was only the pipes. That house still smelled faintly of antiseptic and cedar, the scent of those last months. During that time, Pastor Miller, the hospice chaplain, used to stop by once or twice a week. He wasn't pushy about prayer. He mostly listened, sometimes reading aloud when Dad's voice gave out. "You'll be all right," he'd told me one night when I'd fallen asleep in the chair. "Kindness comes back around, you'll see." It was something I hadn't believed then. A gust rattled the windows. I shut them tight, checked the back door, and turned off the lights. Upstairs, the hallway felt longer than before, each step echoing on the old pine boards. I paused by the door to Dad's room, the flashlight beam cutting across the floor. That uneven patch on the wall seemed to watch me back. I closed the door and whispered, "Good night, Dad." When I finally crawled into my old bedroom, the rain had softened to a steady rhythm. I lay there staring at the ceiling, counting each creak of the beams. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound felt deliberate, like the house wanted to tell me something but couldn't find the words. Somewhere between the storm and silence, I made up my mind. Tomorrow, I'd open that wall. The morning air was sharp enough to wake every nerve in my body. I moved through the house quietly, the floor cold under my feet. The thought of that hollow sound behind Dad's wall had followed me all night. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It felt like a pull, something unfinished waiting for me. I brought in a screwdriver and an old pry bar from the shed. The wallpaper peeled away in dry strips, and the faint smell of cedar filled the room. Beneath the plaster, there it was, a small wooden box hidden between the beams, perfectly fitted like it had been built there on purpose. I held my breath as I pulled it free. The lid creaked when it opened, revealing a single envelope with my name written in my father's careful, uneven handwriting. A brass key lay beneath it, polished smooth with time. A small tag tied to the key read, Salem Trust and Savings, Box 219. For a while, I just sat there, staring at my name. My father had never been one for letters. He believed in handshakes, hard work, and silence. Seeing my name written by him after he was gone felt almost impossible, like the world had shifted just a little to make space for one more goodbye. The envelope trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. His writing was shaky but deliberate. He told me that what I'd received in the will wasn't a punishment, but a promise. The farmhouse, he said, was not just a memory, it was the foundation of something new. At the end, there was one clear instruction. Take this key to Miss Franklin. She'll know what comes next. I read it 3 times, each word landing heavier than the last. There were no apologies, no justifications, only trust. I changed into clean clothes, folded the letter carefully, and drove into town. The rain from the night before had left the streets glistening, and the air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and coffee. Salem's old buildings looked smaller than I remembered. When I entered the law office, Miss Franklin was already there behind her desk, a stack of documents arranged neatly in front of her. She looked up, her expression softening. "You found it then," she said quietly. I nodded, handing her the key. She stood, moved to a locked cabinet, and returned with a metal security box. Its corners were worn, its edges cold against the light. "This," she said, "was your father's last request. He left instructions that only you could open it." Her words hung in the air while she fitted 2 keys into the box. One hers, one mine. The locks clicked together like a heartbeat. Inside were 3 folders, a sealed envelope, and a thick leather-bound ledger. She explained that my father had created a private trust, separate from the company. Years of savings, investments, and silent work had built something he never spoke about. Every entry in the ledger was written in his hand, small, careful lines that grew steadier over time. The last page carried a figure that made me stop breathing. $3 million. The room tilted for a second. I pressed my palms to the table, the cold metal grounding me. He had planned this quietly, without telling anyone, not even me. He hadn't left me scraps. He'd left me independence. Miss Franklin's voice broke the silence. She said my father trusted me not for the care I gave him, but for the kind of person I was when no one was watching. Those words stayed with me. When I stepped outside, the clouds had thinned. Sunlight poured over the street, reflecting in the puddles. I sat in my car, the letter resting in my lap, and realized I wasn't angry anymore. What my father left wasn't wealth, it was clarity. The house, the letter, the trust, they weren't about inheritance. They were about understanding that value doesn't need to be seen to exist. As I drove home, the farmhouse waited at the end of the long gravel road, the windows glinting faintly in the light. For the first time, it didn't look like an old burden. It looked like a beginning. Weeks passed quietly. The farmhouse had started to feel like mine, each creak, each gust of wind through the shutters sounded less like an echo and more like a rhythm. I didn't rush to do anything with the money. I needed to breathe first. Then one morning, the phone rang. The caller ID showed a name I hadn't seen in weeks. Colin. His voice carried the same confidence it always had, that edge of charm he used when he wanted something. He said he'd just closed a huge contract in Portland, that the company was doing better than ever. I said little, only that I was fine. Before hanging up, he added, "Guess I was right all along. Dad's old ways still work if you know what you're doing." I let him have that moment. He always needed to win, even when no one was keeping score. For a while after that call, I went about my days quietly. I fixed a few leaks in the roof, started clearing the back garden, even began keeping a journal, something Dad used to encourage when life felt too heavy. A few weeks later, another call came. Same name, different tone. His voice was rushed, lower this time. "We lost a client. It's temporary," he said quickly. "Just some accounting delay." He asked how I was, but before I could answer, he hung up. The third call came near midnight. I didn't answer. By the end of that month, the calm I'd built around me started to feel fragile. I decided to meet with someone Dad had mentioned in his letters, a man named Noah Kent, a financial advisor who'd helped him manage the trust in its early years. Noah's office was small, tucked between a hardware store and a bakery in downtown Salem. He greeted me with an easy smile, and the kind of calm people who read numbers for a living often had. He asked how I was adjusting, then looked over the documents Miss Franklin had given me. His fingers traced the margins as if he could read between the lines. "This is solid," he said finally. "Your father was careful, conservative, smart." I told him I wasn't sure what to do with any of it yet. I wasn't interested in growing it, just in not losing it. He nodded. That's exactly what he'd want. Stability, not spectacle. His words reminded me of Dad's quiet habits, the way he fixed what was broken instead of replacing it, the way he preferred small dinners to grand gestures. Noah helped me set up a few accounts, explaining everything patiently. He didn't talk down to me, which was rare. Before I left, he said something that stayed with me. Some people build to be seen, others build to last. Your father built for the second reason. Outside, the sky over Salem was washed pale blue, the kind that looks clean after too much rain. I walked for a while before heading home, thinking about what that meant. That evening, the phone rang again. Colin's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring twice before picking up. He sounded frantic. Deals falling through, investors pulling out. He said he just needed a short loan, just to keep things running. His voice wavered on the last word. "I can't," I said quietly. "You have the company, remember? Dad trusted you with it." There was a pause long enough for me to hear his breathing shift into anger. Then the line went dead. I stood there for a while, the phone still warm in my hand. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, heavy with unspoken things. Later, I went through Dad's ledger again, tracing the neat handwriting, the slow growth of numbers over decades. I realized how patient he'd been. He'd known that real strength isn't loud, it's steady. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because I felt rich, but because, for the first time, I understood what it meant to be secure. That winter came early, colder than usual. The farmhouse roof glittered with frost every morning, and the air outside carried the sharp smell of smoke from neighboring chimneys. I had learned to like the quiet rhythm of those mornings: coffee, ledger, silence. One day, while sorting mail, I saw his name again, not in handwriting, but in print. A headline on a folded newspaper read, "Reed Comfort Systems faces lawsuit over contract breach." The words looked foreign, detached from the brother I used to know. The article mentioned unpaid vendors, missed deadlines, a half-built facility left standing like a skeleton on Portland's outskirts. I closed the paper slowly, realizing what it meant. By noon, the phone began to ring. His voice was still steady, still trying to sound like he was in control. He explained that everything was just a misunderstanding, that the media exaggerated. He said he only needed some temporary help until things smoothed out. The tone underneath was desperation disguised as strategy. I listened without interrupting. When he paused, I said only that Dad had trusted him with the company, and that was still true. The silence on the line stretched thin, then ended with a click. For the rest of the day, I worked outside, trimming the dead branches from the oak tree near the gate. The air bit at my skin, but the cold felt grounding. I didn't think of anger or revenge, just inevitability. A week later, another newspaper arrived. The company had filed for bankruptcy, a complete liquidation. The photograph beneath the headline showed the office door chained shut, a bright orange sign marking its end. I called Miss Franklin to confirm. Her tone was professional but quiet, as though she'd been expecting my call. She told me everything was official now. The creditors had moved in, the staff had been let go, and my brother was under investigation for mismanagement. There was nothing left to save. After we hung up, I stood by the window for a long while. Outside, the ground shimmered faintly under the afternoon sunday. I remembered how Dad used to say that failure wasn't the opposite of success, it was proof that you had ignored what mattered most. The next morning, a voicemail appeared. His voice was raw, almost unrecognizable. He spoke of losing everything: the house, the cars, even friends who had once called him brilliant. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for a place to stay. I didn't call back. There was no satisfaction in it, no triumph, just stillness. That evening, I opened the old ledger again. The ink had faded slightly, but the numbers still held their weight: year after year of careful, patient growth. Dad had never rushed toward success. He'd built it the same way he built everything else, with quiet consistency. I traced the edge of the paper, thinking of the difference between the two men he had raised. Colin wanted the world to notice him. Dad only wanted things to work. Somewhere between them, I had finally learned which kind of strength lasted. Before going to bed, I found myself standing in Dad's old study. The air still carried that faint scent of cedar. On the wall, his framed photograph watched over the room, his eyes calm, his posture certain. Behind him in that picture, Colin and I were just children, both smiling at the same horizon. I turned off every light except the lamp on his desk. It cast a thin gold circle across the papers, warm against the cold night. The company was gone. The arguments were gone. But the lesson remained. What's built on ego crumbles fast, and what's built on patience outlives the noise. I closed the door gently behind me. The house stayed quiet, the light still burning inside the study, steady, constant, like a heartbeat that refused to fade. Spring came slowly that year, as if the world itself had grown tired of endings. The snow receded in thin lines, and the fields outside the farmhouse began to show color again. For months, I'd lived in stillness, learning how to exist without waiting for the next storm. Each morning, I walked through the house, fixing what time had ignored: new paint on the porch rails, tightened hinges on the kitchen doors, a coat of varnish over Dad's old desk. The work wasn't grand, but it was steady, and that steadiness felt like breathing again. Some afternoons I drove into Salem, stopping at the local diner or hardware store. People had started to recognize me as the woman who bought back the Reed place, though no one ever mentioned the name with pity. They talked to me like a neighbor, not a story. One day, I visited the community center where Dad once volunteered to repair air conditioning units. The place had grown old, the wiring flickering, the heating unreliable. I offered to help. The director, a gray-haired woman named Marla, smiled with the kind of exhaustion that comes from running things with too few hands. So I started spending my weekends there, repainting walls, replacing filters, learning which pipes creaked the loudest. The work spread through me like something remembered. It was during one of those weekends that I saw Noah again. He'd come to drop off some financial forms for the center's renovations. His easy calm was the same, but this time, he looked at me with quiet understanding. He asked how I'd been. I said I'd been building, then we both smiled, because he understood I didn't mean walls. Over the next few weeks, he helped me set up a small local fund using part of Dad's trust, one meant for practical repairs in the community. We called it the Reed Foundation, though I never advertised it under that name. It wasn't about legacy anymore. It was about usefulness. Life fell into rhythm again. Mornings started with strong coffee and the hum of the tool shed. Afternoons were filled with sawdust, the sound of nails tapping into new frames, and the faint laughter of volunteers at the center. Every now and then, I thought about Colin. Rumors said he'd left Oregon for good. A few former employees reached out, saying they hoped he was rebuilding somewhere else. I didn't wish him harm, nor forgiveness, just distance. The old farmhouse had changed too. What used to creak now held firm. The smell of cedar mixed with fresh paint, and light reached corners that had stayed dim for years. On the mantel above the fireplace sat Dad's framed photograph, now surrounded by signs of life: a stack of books, a cup of coffee, a jar of fresh daisies from the backyard. Sometimes, I'd stand there and speak to him quietly, telling him about small victories: the heater at the center finally working again, the grant approved, the laughter that now filled rooms once silent. I never expected an answer. The comfort was in saying it out loud. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat on the porch steps watching the sky bleed into gold. The air smelled like rain and cut grass. For the first time, I felt that the house wasn't something I had inherited, it was something I had earned. I realized then what rebuilding truly meant. It wasn't starting over, it was continuing, piece by piece, without the need for applause or validation. It was about choosing peace over noise, meaning over pride. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of cedar again. It felt like my father's quiet approval, a reminder that he had left me everything I needed, not in wealth, but in patience. When the porch light flickered on, I stayed there a while longer, listening to the crickets rise with the night. The house stood steady behind me, its windows glowing softly. For once, I didn't feel like I was living in someone else's story. I was finally writing my own. Summer came early that year. The days stretched long and golden, the kind that made time feel generous again. The farmhouse had settled into its new rhythm: quiet mornings, steady work, and evenings filled with the hum of life instead of echoes. I was fixing the fence by the driveway when the mail truck stopped. The driver handed me an envelope with no return address, only my name written in plain blue ink. For a moment, I thought it might be another thank you note from the community center. But when I opened it, the handwriting told me otherwise. It was Colin's. The letter was brief. He wrote that he was living in Nevada now, working at a construction company, trying to start over. He said he'd lost everything but had learned something he should have known long ago, that Dad had never valued money as much as he valued integrity. At the end, he wrote that he didn't expect forgiveness, only that he hoped I was well. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and set it on the table beside the porch light. There was no anger left in me, just the quiet understanding that some distances were meant to remain. That evening, I called Noah to ask about a local family whose house had caught fire the week before. The community fund could cover the repairs, he said, and we arranged for supplies to be delivered the next morning. As we spoke, the sound of tools clinking in the background reminded me that healing often looked like work. After the call, I stood in the yard watching the sky fade into copper. The air smelled like sawdust and summer rain. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel weighed down by what had been taken from me. I felt defined by what I had chosen to rebuild. Later that night, I went through one of Dad's old boxes in the attic. Inside were a few keepsakes: his watch, a small hammer, and a photograph of him standing in front of the original workshop, sleeves rolled up, eyes steady. Tucked behind the photo was a note in his handwriting I'd never seen before. It read, "If you ever wonder whether I was proud of you, I was. Always." I sat there for a while, holding the paper as the wind outside rattled softly through the trees. The house felt alive again, not because of money or legacy, but because I had finally learned to live by the same quiet strength he once did. When I looked at the photograph again, I saw more than the past. I saw continuity, something that didn't end with him, or even with me. It was in every wall repaired, every person helped, every day that began without resentment. I placed the note in a small wooden frame and set it on the mantel beside his picture. The fire crackled softly below it, the light flickering over both frames like two steady flames. As I turned off the lights that night, I didn't think about the house as an inheritance anymore. It was a creation, one built from lessons earned, not given. Somewhere out there, my brother was facing the life he had shaped for himself. His downfall wasn't punishment, it was the cost of misunderstanding what mattered. And in a quiet way, that realization felt like justice enough. The next morning, I opened the windows wide. Sunlight spilled across the floors, catching in the dust and turning it to gold. The air smelled of cut grass and promise. Maybe life isn't about what we're given, I thought, but about what we decide to keep alive. So that's what I chose: to keep building, to keep learning, to keep forgiving only where it healed me. Because sometimes peace doesn't come from reconciliation, it comes from release. And if my story finds its way to you, I hope you remember this. No inheritance, no amount of wealth, no success means anything if it costs you your kindness. Thank you for listening until the end of my story. If any part of it made you think about your own family, your choices, or the things that really matter, share what you feel in the comments. I'd love to hear what you've learned too.